Buyers, how to get your offer accepted in an ultra competitive real estate market. I'm going to tell you how to do that next with the 6 ways to win the bid. Stay tuned. So buyers, just when you thought you saw everything in real estate, this housing market, especially here in South Jersey, just keeps wanting to roll higher and higher. Multiple offers are the norm. So what do you do if you want to purchase in this market to gain an advantage? I'm going to tell you all about that next. I'm Joe Wiessner, and for those who don't know me, I've been a real estate broker for over 20 years in South Jersey, and my firm is one of the leading and largest independent real estate companies in South Jersey. We represent buyers and sellers, so we see both ends of the spectrum all the time, and we know what they're doing to gain an advantage, the buyers, and what's attracting the seller. So this will be relevant information and key for those buyers that do want to buy in the market. And this will also help their agents get a little more creative in their offering, because I'm going in real time with what I see every day on the proposals that come into my office. These methods that I'm going to discuss today are going to increase your odds, if you're a buyer, of winning the bid. And make sure you hit that subscribe button for more videos just like this one. So here's buyer tip number 1 on how to win the bid. And this is probably the most popular item that's incorporated in the proposals to purchase. So it's buying the property as is. Everybody seems to have a different idea on what as is means, but I'm here to tell you that it's what the contract says, not all of the hyperbole that comes up in the negotiations. There's terms that are thrown around for informational purposes only, for major repairs up to X amount of dollars. All of these things, have some meaning in the deal, but the reality is that the buyer always has the right to do an inspection, regardless if the seller is unwilling at the outset of the deal to do repairs. So they could say, I'm not going to make any repairs, but that doesn't stop the buyer from having their inspection, the right to do one. They do. It doesn't stop the buyer from issuing a repair request list to the seller, and the seller at that point would either accept or reject that list. And if it is rejected and it was of such importance to the buyer that they felt that they couldn't carry on, they would have a right to void the contract. So as is does not mean that you're jammed into the property as the buyer. You have rights. There's a couple forms of as is, and there's I'll go over the first one, the blanket as is, where the entire contract is as is. You as the buyer, you still have rights to do your home inspection, your termite inspection, radon inspection, whatever inspection you wanted to do, you have the right to do so, but it covers the entire contract. So this would also include the CO inspection. So you're responsible for paying for all the inspections, and if it has a well, you'd be responsible for that as well. In most cases, the well test would be on the seller to conduct, but in a strictly as is, where the buyer's taking command of all those things, the buyer would take care of that. So you have the blanket as is, where you're taking care of everything, and you would have the right still to petition the seller if there was something amiss that you couldn't live with. And if the seller refused, you would have the opportunity to void the contract. The next component of as is the selective as is. When the buyer makes a proposal to purchase, the agent submits that to the listing agent. It may be, it's going to be a home inspection for informational purposes only, but it's non-specific on the other elements in the contract that are inspection items like termite inspection, radon inspection, CCO inspection. So in these types of proposals, it's understood that the buyer is acknowledging the fact that the seller doesn't want to make any repairs, or they're offering that up to sweeten the deal. But it does not negate the rights of the buyer to cancel the contract if the seller refused to fix something that came up on a home inspection. The seller would still be responsible in this case for their inspections, which would be likely the CCO, and if it's got well water, the water test. And then the buyer would conduct their customary inspections, which would be the home inspection, termite inspection, radon inspection, and others if they wanted those. So that's the selective nature of it. It does not mean that the buyer is compelled to buy the property if there is a major home inspection issue. It just kind of gives some ground to both sides, some latitude where the seller doesn't have to fix anything, but the buyer still has a right to cancel the contract if there is something that they felt so uncomfortable with and the seller refused to fix that. So an example of selective would be the home inspection. And then another example of selective would be, say there was a huge tree in the front yard and it was a situation where it was overhanging the house. Well, that could be a selective element that would be sold as is. So those things are all different ways and variations to go about making it more palatable for the seller and more likely that they would choose your offer with that specific language in there. So as is important, but there's an incredible amount of variation in that language. So you have to act cautiously and you have to have an agent that knows how to navigate all of that. The second element that you could utilize to help win the bid is the gap appraisal clause. So this gets a little bit more esoteric, a little bit more heady, but it's a element that works and is very, very appealing to the sellers if, as the buyer, you have the financial wherewithal to do it. So let me give you an example of the gap appraisal clause. Let's say that the property was listed at $300,000 and you felt that there were going to be multiple offers on the property. You might want to talk to your buyer's agent and say, hey, this gap appraisal, let's put that in there and let's bid it up to win it to $320,000. So that's $20,000 above the listed price. So in that case, what the seller and buyer would agree to is a purchase price of $320,000, and let's say that it was negotiated that there was a $20,000 gap appraisal incorporated. What that means is, even though the purchase price is $320,000, if the appraisal came in less than $320,000 but not lower than $300,000, the buyer would be compelled to carry on and conclude settlement. Meaning, the lender is only going to lend on what the appraised value is. The buyer would have to come to the table with the difference. So that's the gap appraisal situation there. So you have to be prepared as the buyer to have the extra cash just in case it doesn't appraise, because you are contractually obligated. If you do not follow through that way, you would be in breach of the contract. However, if the property in that case, purchase price is $320,000, gap appraisal of $20,000, then the threshold is $300,000. If the appraisal were to come in below $300,000, then all bets are off at that point. Either the buyer or the seller has the right to void the contract, or there's a renegotiation, more commonly is what happens. So the gap appraisal clause is something that's very powerful, but you have to have the cash on the sideline if you are the buyer to make it happen. The third thing that I see happening sometimes, not as much as the gap appraisal, is just, hey, let's waive the appraisal altogether. So that's a really bold move. Sellers love it when buyers do that because they're saying, hey, we are really committed to the property, we want it, and we're going to do whatever it takes to win this property. So the buyer has to have the cash on the sideline, just as in the gap appraisal, but there is no floor to that. The gap appraisal, there is a floor to how much the buyer would have to bring to the table. If you waive the appraisal altogether, which I have seen recently, there is no floor to that. And if it were 20 grand or 30 grand or 40 grand under the appraised value, the buyer would have to come up with that money. So much higher risk, but I do see these coming through on offers, and the sellers absolutely love it. The fourth thing that I see buyers doing to win the bids is if they were going to get financing, I get a call, there's multiple offers, the buyer's agent knows that there's multiple offers on the property, and they're willing to drop the financing contingency and pay cash altogether. So that's fine. What they would have to do in that case is submit a proof of funds to my office. And what happens in that case is that the buyer's agent will redact the numbers, the account numbers that are on the statement, and some other pertinent information where we wouldn't be able to see the exact, sourcing of those funds. But we would have the number, the dollar amount right on the statement, and I could relay that information over to the seller side, and the seller can make a decision whether or not that cash offer was acceptable. So cash is always better than financing. The reason being is that it takes the appraisal out of the equation. Some buyers are getting home equity loans on properties, which is a sticky situation. Probably not recommended to do that. But given the choice, if you had the wherewithal and did have the ability to come up with the cash, cash is always king. Number 5 on my list today of the top 6 things that buyers can do to help win the bid is flexible terms for the seller. So what are the seller's needs? What's their ideal situation? Your buyer's agent should really seek out and ask the listing agent what would be most beneficial and behoove the seller situation. So one element that's really a big deal to so many sellers is that they have no place to go on the other end, and there are suitable housing contingencies on the seller side that are incorporated into the deal. So allowing the seller to find suitable housing and have a longer than what would have been normal in the past cushion of days. I'd say what was normal prior to suitable housing was 30 days, but in this red hot seller's market, often those suitable housing contingencies run 60 days, 90 days, where the seller would have the opportunity to find something after the agreement of sale was signed between the buyer and the seller. And in that time period, maybe they find something in the first week, maybe it takes them the entire term. But if the term does come to the end, then the buyer and seller would have a right to void the contract if the seller had not found something already. But what usually happens if it does come to the end of, say, the 45 or 60 days, whatever is allowable contractually, at that point, there's usually a renegotiation. The other scenario there in getting the seller more favorable terms to move at a much slower pace would be to do a use and occupancy agreement. So a use and occupancy agreement is where the buyer would purchase the seller's property and allow the seller to stay there after settlement. So it's not a lease agreement. It's very important that there's a understanding of the difference between a landlord-tenant lease and a use and occupancy agreement. Use and occupancy agreement doesn't have the same landlord-tenant rights that would be in a normal type of lease. So we see that from time to time. That's something that is apparent and happening in this market. So use and occupancy agreement where the seller stays for a month or 2 months after the fact, and then the buyer takes possession of the property at settlement and then moves in 2 months later, if that's the case, after the seller has exhausted their use and occupancy agreement date. The other thing that is more open-ended would be a more lengthy settlement date. So we've been doing some settlements that are 75 days out, 90 days out, 120 days out. So that would be a more flexible type of situation. And sometimes there's no net of the use and occupancy agreement or seller suitable housing. So it's more open-ended, and those work out quite well usually. The thing that happens though when you have these extended time periods is that the buyer is getting a mortgage most of the time, and the lock-in rates come up against expiration. That's not a problem when interest rates are stable or going down, but it could be a real problem as interest rates are going up, as they are in this environment. So we often on the listing side incorporate language that the seller isn't responsible for any rate lock extensions or expirations, because a lot of times without that language, the buyer will come to the seller and say, hey, will you pay for my new rate lock extension? Not only is there a cost there, but as the interest rates go up, it's a increased monthly cost for the life of that loan. So it's something not to be taken lightly, and the buyers are well aware of these items. And lastly, number 6, which I really like it when buyers do this. I think it's very nice. I like reading these to the seller, is a nice letter from the buyer to the seller. So explaining how much they love their house and how they could see their children playing there, and it's perfect for their life situation, a little bit about themselves. That really is helpful, especially when the language in the letter states that the occupations of the buyers, and that really paints a picture in my mind that these are very stable people as far as their finances are concerned. So all of those things are really, I think, good ideas. I like reading them to the sellers, and the sellers like hearing the accolades about their property. So it's a really nice touch. So buyers out there, is your buyer's agent talking about these things? If you keep losing homes that you want, be aware that these are the tactics that will make you more competitive out there in the marketplace. And take it from me, I know, because I see these proposals coming in all the time. This market's not going to last forever, but this is what you need to do, buyers, right now in order to win. And those, my friends, my buyer friends out there, these are the 6 ways to increase your odds of winning and getting your bid accepted. And buyers, don't forget to check out our website at thinkw.com, because all the latest data, new listings just listed, all the criteria pending and solds are there. And don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button and hit the bell so you don't miss a single thing going forward. And I'll catch you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching.